The Industrial Revolution from 1750 to the 1900s. Before the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, people lived in pretty much the same way as their ancestors had for hundreds of years, relying almost solely on farming to make a living. Servants ran the households and catered to the family's needs. The Industrial Revolution was a slow process in which major technological advances were made from about 1750 to the early 1900s. Production shifted from simple hand tools to complex machines. New sources of power replaced human and animal power. In the 250 years since it began, the Industrial Revolution has spread from Britain to the rest of Europe, to North America, and around the globe. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, people lived a rural or country lifestyle. They lived much like their ancestors who lived before them 100 years ago. Nothing had really changed. Most people lived in the country, not cities. The richest people were rural landowners who lived on big country estates. Renters lived in small cottages with dirt floors, sometimes sharing with farm animals. Everyone in the farming family worked hard. Boys helped their fathers in the fields or at the workbench, while girls helped their mothers with household duties. Unless they could sell surplus food in nearby towns, they grew little more than what they needed for themselves. Some families would make money by making thread or yarn for clothes. Because of the Industrial Revolution, the lifestyle of people all around the world began to change. Urbanization took place. Urbanization is the process of people moving to cities from the rural country. People would now move to the city for work, and instead of making their own clothes, bedding, furniture, and tools, people would buy them in stores in a city. We often think of revolutions as violent and swift, but a revolution by definition is a radical change in society and social structure. The Industrial Revolution was just that, a fundamental change in human behavior, social and political structure. The Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain. Because so, this small nation will become one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in the world. Why did it begin in Britain? It was a perfect storm of four factors. In 1700, small farms covered England's landscape. Wealthy landowners, however, began buying up much of the land that village farmers had once worked. After buying up the land, these landowners enclosed their land with fences or hedges. The larger area of land enabled them to cultivate larger fields. Within these larger fields, called enclosures, landowners experimented with more productive seedling and harvesting methods to increase crop yields. The enclosure movement had two important results. First, landowners tried new agricultural methods. Second, large landowners forced small farmers to become tenant farmers or to give up farming and move to the cities. Jethro Tull was one of the first of these scientific farmers. He saw the usual way of sowing seeds by scattering it across the ground was wasteful. Many seeds failed to take root. He solved this problem with an invention called the seed drill in about 1701. It allowed farmers to sow seeds in well-spaced rows at specific depths. A larger share of the seeds took root, boosting crop yields. The process of crop rotation proved to be one of the best developments by the scientific farmers. The process improved upon older methods of crop rotation. One year, for example, a farmer might plant a field with wheat, which exhausted soil nutrients. The next year he planted a root crop such as turnips to restore nutrients. This might be followed in turn by barley and then clover. The agricultural revolution contributed to a rapid growth of population that continues today. Precise population statistics for the 1700s are rare, but those that do exist show a huge increase in population. In 1700, what was the approximate population of Great Britain? Well, it was about 5 million. 100 years later, what was the population? It had changed to almost 9 million. Britain's population soared from 5 million in 1700 to almost 9 million in 1800. The population of Europe as a whole shot up from roughly 120 million to about 190 million during the same period. This was growth that had never been seen before labor supply was necessary. Large number of workers were needed to mine coal and iron, build the factories, and run the machines. Why the population boom? The population boom of the 1700s was due more to declining death rates than rising birth rates. The agricultural revolution reduced the risk of famine. Because they ate better, women were healthier and had stronger babies. In the 1800s, better hygiene and sanitation, along with improved medical care, further slowed deaths from disease. The population boom would continue today. Britain was a small nation in area. However, it had a large supply of coal to power steam engines. It also had plentiful iron to build the new machines. In addition to natural resources, a labor supply was necessary. Large numbers of workers were needed to mine the coal and iron, build the factories, and run the machines. The agricultural revolution of the 16 and 1700s freed many people in Britain from farm labor and led to a population boom. From the mid 1600s to 1700s, trade from a growing overseas empire helped the British economy prosper. Beginning with the slave trade, the business class accumulated capital or wealth to invest in enterprises such as shipping, mines, railroads, and factories. Also, the agricultural revolution made large farming estates wealthy. Now, these wealthy farmers had extra money to invest in new ventures. Britons could take on the financial risks by investing in new ideas, new inventions, new technology, and industry. Middle and upper class entrepreneurs brought all of this together. They invested their capital, used Britain's new labor force and natural resources to develop new inventions, and created an industrial revolution. In looking at the map on the slide, where is Britain exporting cotton cloth to? They exported cotton cloth to South Africa, India, China, the East Indies, and North and South America. Where was Britain importing cotton from? They imported from India, Africa, Egypt, and the U.S. In the 1600s and the 1700s, with people in Great Britain and overseas eager to buy cool, colorful cotton cloth, a series of technological advances revolutionized cloth production. Great Britain had large colonies all over the globe, including the 13 colonies in North America. These colonies were markets or customers. Demand for cotton cloth kept going up, thus increasing pressure on workers for higher output. Before the Revolution, many families made money by making yarn or thread to weave into cloth. A merchant would bring raw fiber to several families in their homes. Women and children usually cleaned, sorted, and spun the fiber into yarn or thread. Men usually did the actual weaving. Then the merchant collected the yarn, paid the spinner, and took the yarn to others who would weave, clean, and dye the material. Finally, the merchant took the finished products to market and sold it for the highest possible price. One invention led to another. In 1733, a machinist named John Kay made a shuttle that sped back and forth on wheels. This flying shuttle, a boat-shaped piece of wood to which yarn was attached, doubled the work a weaver could do in a day. Spinners could not keep up with these speedy weavers, and around 1764 a textile worker named James Hargreaves invented a spinning wheel he named after his daughter. James Hargreaves invented a spinner called the spinning jenny. It produced yarn very fast. One person could produce 8 spools of yarn at once instead of just one. He initially tried to keep his invention a secret, but other spinners became suspicious because his family produced so much yarn. They burst into his house, destroyed his machine, and ran him and his family out of town. Textile workers operated the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny by hand. Then Richard Arkwright invented the water frame in 1769. This machine used the water power from rapid streams to drive spinning wheels. In 1779, Samuel Crompton combined features of the spinning jenny and the water frame to produce the spinning mule. The spinning mule made thread that was stronger, finer, and more consistent than any of the earlier spinning machines. Run by water power, Edmund Cartwright's power loom sped up weaving after its invention in 1787. These new machines would put an end to the putting out system because they got to be so big that you couldn't put them in factory workers' houses. They moved into large buildings built near major waterways, marking the beginning of the factory system. The first factories were developed for cloth production and were built near rivers and streams because they needed water power. James Watt, a mathematical instrument maker at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, thought about the problem for 2 years. In 1765, Watt figured out a way to make the steam engine work faster and more efficiently while burning less fuel. In 1774, Watt joined with a businessman named Matthew Boulton. Boulton was an entrepreneur. He paid Watt a salary and encouraged him to build a better engine. The significance of steam in the factory system was that steam power allowed factories that had once closed down when the rivers froze or flowed too low to now run continuously. Factories could now be built far from waterways. In addition to factories, steam also could propel boats. An American inventor named Robert Fulton ordered a steam engine from Boulton and Watt. He built a steamboat called the Clermont, which made its first successful trip in 1807. The Clermont later ferried passengers up and down New York's Hudson River. In England, water transportation improved with the creation of a network of canals or human-made waterways. By the mid-1800s, 4,250 miles of inland channels had cut the cost of transporting both raw materials and finished goods. In 1804, an English engineer named Richard Trevithick won a bet of several $1,000s. He did this by hauling 10 tons of iron over 10 miles of track in a steam-driven locomotive. Other British engineers soon built improved versions of Trebek's locomotive. One of these early railroad engineers was George Stephenson. In 1825, Stephenson built the world's first railroad line. It ran 27 miles from the Yorkshire coalfields to the port in Stockton on the North Sea. It used four locomotives that Stephenson had designed and built. Steam engine trains did not have to follow the course of a river. This meant tracks could go places rivers did not, allowing factory owners and merchants to ship goods over land. By 1870, rail lines were all over Britain, Europe, and the US. Stop this video now and watch the video on Schoology titled Steam Engine. Stop the video and watch the video entitled The Industrial Revolution that is located on Schoology. The pace of industrialization accelerated rapidly in Britain. By the 1800s, people could earn higher wages in factories than on farms. With this money, more people could afford to heat their homes with coal from Wales and dine on Scottish beef. They wore better clothing, too, woven on power looms in England's industrial cities. Cities grew with waves of job seekers. For centuries, most Europeans had lived in rural areas. After 1800, the balance shifted toward cities. This shift was caused by the growth of the factory system, where the manufacturing of goods was concentrated in a central location. Between 1800 and 1850, the number of European cities boasting more than 100,000 inhabitants rose from 22 to 47. Most of Europe's urban areas at least doubled in population, some even quadrupled. This period was one of urbanization, city building, and the movement of people to those cities. London was the country's most important city. It had a population of about 1 million people by 1800. During the 1800s, its population exploded, providing a huge labor pool and market for new industry. London became Europe's largest city with twice as many people as its closest rival, Paris. In Manchester, England, and elsewhere, there was a great divide in urban population. The rich and middle class lived in pleasant neighborhoods. Huge numbers of poor, however, struggled to survive in foul-smelling slums. Because many cities grew rapidly, they had no development plans, sanitary codes, or building codes. Also, they lacked adequate housing, education, and police protection for the people who poured in from the countryside to seek jobs. Most of the unpaved streets had no drains and garbage collected in heaps on them. Workers lived in dark, dirty shelters with whole families crowding into one bedroom. They packed into tiny rooms in tenements, which were multi-story buildings that were divided into crowded apartments. These buildings had no running water, only community pumps. There were no sewerage or sanitation systems, with wastes and garbage rotting in the streets. Cholera and other diseases spread rapidly. In time, reformers pushed for laws to improve conditions in city slums. In 1842, a British government study showed that the average lifespan to be 17 years for working class people in one large city, compared with 38 years in a nearby rural area. To increase production, factory owners wanted to keep their machines running as many hours as possible. As a result, the average worker spent 14 hours a day at the job, 6 days a week. Work did not change with the season as it did on the farm. Instead, work remained the same week after week, year after year. Industry also posed new dangers for workers. Factories were seldom well lit or clean. Exhausted workers suffered accidents from machines that had no safety devices. They might lose a finger, a limb, or even their lives. A boiler might explode or a drive belt might catch an arm. And there was no government programs to provide aid in case of injury. Workers were exposed to other dangers as well. Textile workers constantly breathed in air filled with lint. If workers were sick or injured, they lost their jobs. The most dangerous conditions of all were found in coal mines. Frequent accidents, damp conditions, and the constant breathing of coal dust made the average miner's lifespan 10 years shorter than that of other workers. Many workers died of black lung disease from the 10 to 12 hours a day of breathing coal dust. Many women and children were employed in the mining industry because they were the cheapest source of labor. In the textile industry, diseases such as pneumonia, which is a respiratory condition in which there is an inflammation of the lungs, or tuberculosis, an infection in the lungs, spread, killing many workers. Employers often preferred to hire women workers rather than men. They thought women could adapt more easily to machines and were easier to manage than men. More important, they were able to pay women less than men, even for the same work. Factory work created special problems for women. Their new jobs took them out of their homes for 12 hours or more a day. Then they returned to crowded slum tenements to feed and clothe their families, clean, and cope with sickness and other problems. Family life had been hard for poor rural cottagers. In industrial towns, though, it was becoming even grimmer. Factories and mines also hired many children. Often nimble fingered and quick moving children changed spools in textile mills. Others clambered through narrow mine shifts pushing coal carts. Because children had helped with the farm work, parents accepted the idea of child labor, and the wages the children earned were needed to keep families from starving. Employers often hired orphans, making deals with local officials who were glad to have the children taken off their hands. Overseers beat children accused of idling. A few enlightened factory owners did provide basic education and a decent life for child workers. More often, though, children, like their parents, were slaves to the machines. In the 1830s and 1840s, British lawmakers looked into abuses in factories and mines. Government commissions heard about children as young as 5 years old working in factories. Some died, others were stunted in growth or had twisted limbs. Most were uneducated. Slowly, Parliament passed laws to regulate child labor in mines and factories. The new middle class transformed the social structure of Great Britain. In the past, landowners and aristocrats had occupied the top position in British society. With most of the wealth, they wielded the social and political power. Now, some factory owners, merchants, and bankers grew wealthier than the landowners and aristocrats. Yet, important social distinctions divided the two wealthy classes. Landowners looked down on those who made their fortunes in the vulgar business world. Not until late in the 1800s were rich entrepreneurs considered the social equals of the lords in the countryside. Generally, a larger middle class, neither rich nor poor, emerged. The upper middle class consisted of government employees, doctors, lawyers, and managers of factories, mines, and shops. The lower middle class included factory overseers and such skilled workers as tool makers, mechanical drafters, and printers. These people enjoyed a comfortable standard of living. During the 1800s to 1850s, however, laborers, or the working class, saw little improvement in their living and working conditions. They watched their livelihoods disappear as machines replaced them. In frustration, some smashed the machines they thought were putting them out of work. Despite the problems that followed industrialization, the Industrial Revolution had a number of positive aspects. It created jobs for workers and it contributed to the wealth of the nation. It fostered technological progress and invention. It greatly increased the production of goods and raised the standard of living. Perhaps most important, it provided the hope of improvement in people's lives. The Industrial Revolution produced a number of other benefits as well. These included healthier diets, better housing, and cheaper mass produced clothing. Because the Industrial Revolution created a demand for engineers as well as clerical and professional workers, it expanded educational opportunities. The middle and upper classes prospered immediately from the Industrial Revolution. For the workers, it took a little longer, but their lives gradually improved during the 1800s. Laborers eventually won higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions after they joined together to form labor unions. The long term effects of the Industrial Revolution are still evident. Many people today in industrialized countries can afford consumer goods that would have been considered luxuries 50 or 60 years ago. In addition, their living and working conditions are much improved over those of the workers in the 19th century. Also, profits derived from industrialization produce tax revenues. These funds allowed local, state, and federal governments to invest in urban improvements and raise the standard of living of most city dwellers. Many poor people lived in slums. They packed into tiny rooms and tenements, multi-story buildings divided into crowded apartments. In the slums, there was no sewage or sanitation system, and waste and garbage rotted in the streets. Cholera and other diseases spread rapidly. Many parents were unwilling to allow their children to work in these new textile factories. To overcome this labor shortage, factory owners had to find other ways of obtaining workers. One solution to the problem was to buy children from orphanages and workhouses. These children became known as pauper apprentices. This involved children signing contracts that virtually made them the property of the factory owner. Pauper apprentices were also cheaper to house than adult workers. It cost Samuel Gregg, who owned the large Quarry Bank Mill at Stile, $130 to build a cottage for a family, whereas his pauper apprentice house cost $400 and provided living accommodations for over 90 children. The same approach was taken by the owners of silk mills. George Caldwell, who owned a silk mill in Braintree, Essex, took children from workhouses in London. Although offered children of all ages, he usually took them from within the ages of 10 and 13. Courtauld insisted that the child arrived with a complete change of common clothing. A contract was signed with the workhouse that stated that Courtauld would be paid $7 for each child taken. Another $7 was paid after the child's first year. The child also signed a contract with Courtauld that bound them to the mill until the age of 21. Children who worked long hours in the textile mills became very tired and found it difficult to maintain the speed required by the overlookers. Children were usually hit with a strap to make them work faster. In some factories, children were dipped head first into the water cistern if they became drowsy. Children were also punished for arriving late for work and for talking to the other children. Parish apprentices who ran away from the factory were in danger of being sent to prison. Children who were considered potential runaways were placed in irons. Elizabeth Bentley was interviewed by Michael Sadler's parliamentary committee on June 4th, 1832. She worked from 5 in the morning till 9 at night. I lived 2 miles from the mill. We had no clock. If I had been too late at the mill, I would have been quartered. I mean that if I had been a quarter of an hour too late, half an hour would have been taken off. I only got a penny an hour, and then they would have taken a halfpenny. Factory owners were responsible for providing their pauper apprentices with food. Children constantly complained about the quality of the food. In most textile mills, the children had to eat their meals while still working. This meant that the food tended to get covered with the dust from the cloth. Workers were often abandoned from the moment that an accident occurs. Their wages stopped, no medical attendance is provided, and whatever the extent of the injury, no compensation is afforded. In 1842, a German visitor noted that he had seen so many people in the streets of Manchester without arms and legs that it was like living in the midst of an army that had just returned from a campaign. Britain was the most productive and wealthiest country in the world, and they wanted to keep the secrets of industrialization to themselves. To do so, Britain had forbid engineers, mechanics, and tool makers to leave the country. In 1789, a 20-year-old bearded Briton who claimed to be a farmer boarded a ship bound for New York. He did so without telling anyone, even his mother, and he wore a disguise. His papers said he was a farmer, but he was actually a smuggler. What did he smuggle? Knowledge and intellectual rights. Slater had memorized the details about a mill he had supervised and planned to recreate the mill from memory in the United States. The United States possessed the same resources that allowed Britain to mechanize its industries. America had fast flowing rivers, rich deposits of coal and iron ore, and a supply of laborers that made up farm workers and immigrants. 2 months later, Slater had built a spinner for memory, introducing the fast machine to the U.S. The following year, an inventor named Moses Brown opened the first factory in the United States to house Slater's machines in Rhode Island. But the factory mass produced only one part of finished cloth, the thread. In 1813, Francis Cabot Lowell of Boston and four other investors revolutionized the American textile industry. They mechanized every stage in the manufacture of cloth. Their weaving factory in Waltham, Massachusetts, earned them enough money to fund a larger operation in another Massachusetts town. When Lowell died, the remaining partners named the town after him. By the 1820s, Lowell, Massachusetts became a booming manufacturing center and a model for other such towns. Thousands of young single women flocked from their rural homes to work as mill girls in factory towns. There they could make higher wages and have some independence. However, to ensure proper behavior, they were watched closely inside and outside the factory by their employers. The mill girls toiled for more than 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for decent wages. For some, the mill job was an alternative to being a servant and was often the only job open to them. Textiles led the way, but clothing manufacture and shoemaking also underwent mechanization, especially in the Northeast. Skilled workers and farmers had formerly worked at home. Now they labored in factories in towns and cities such as Waltham, Lowell, and Lawrence, Massachusetts. Building large businesses like railroads required a great deal of money. To raise the money, entrepreneurs sold shares of stock or certain rights of ownership. Thus, people who bought stock became part owners of the businesses, which were called corporations. A corporation is a business owned by stockholders who share its profits but are not personally responsible for its debts. Corporations were able to raise large amounts of capital needed to invest in industrial equipment. In the late 1800s, large corporations such as Standard Oil, founded by John D. Rockefeller, and Carnegie Steel Company, founded by Andrew Carnegie, sprang up. They sought to control every aspect of their own industries in order to make big profits. Big business, the giant corporations that controlled entire industries, also made big profits by reducing the cost of producing goods. In the United States, as elsewhere, people earned low wages for laboring long hours, while stockholders earned high profits and corporate leaders made fortunes. Stop this video and watch the videos titled Eli Whitney and Henry Ford on Schoology. During his career, Thomas Edison patented more than 1,000 inventions, including the light bulb and the phonograph. Early in his career, Edison started a research laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Most of his important inventions were developed there. The idea of a research laboratory may have been Edison's most important invention. Other inventors helped harness electricity to transmit sounds over great distances. Alexander Graham Bell was a teacher of deaf students who invented the telephone in his spare time. He displayed the device at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. In the 1880s, German inventors used a gasoline engine to power a vehicle, the automobile. Automobile technology developed quickly, but since many early cars were built by hand, they were expensive. As fast-working machines replaced more costly human labor and enabled industrialists to mass produce, an American mechanic named Henry Ford decided to make cars that were affordable for most people. Ford used standardized, interchangeable parts first developed by Whitney. He also built them on an assembly line, A line of workers who each put a single piece on the unfinished cars as they passed on a moving belt. Because of politics in Germany, pockets of industrialization appeared, as in the coal area of the Ruhr Valley in west central Germany. Beginning around 1835, Germany began to copy the British model. Germany imported British equipment and engineers. German manufacturers also sent their children to England to learn industrial management. Most important, Germany built railroad cars that linked its growing manufacturing cities, such as Frankfurt, with the Ruhr Valley coal and iron ore deposits. Germany's economic strength spurred its ability to develop as a military power. By the late 1800s, a unified imperial Germany had become both an industrial and a military giant. Looking at the map, what countries were industrialized by the mid 1800s? France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Switzerland. Stop this video and watch the video entitled Child Labor on Schoology. Since the 1800s, people have debated whether the Industrial Revolution was a blessing or a curse. The early industrial movement brought terrible hardships, but organized labor groups helped to improve these conditions. Worker associations evolved into labor unions. Labor unions protested in many ways, including strikes. Factory owners blacklisted people suspected of being union members in order to stop the spread of workers joining unions. The British Parliament even banned unions in 1800. Reformers pressed for laws to improve working conditions. Labor unions won the right to bargain with employers for better wages, hours, and working conditions. Eventually, working class men gained the right to vote, which gave them political power. Despite the social problems caused by the Industrial Revolution, low pay, unemployment, dismal living conditions, the industrial age did bring material benefits. As demand for mass produced goods grew, new factories opened, creating more jobs. Wages rose so that workers had enough left after paying rent and buying food to buy a newspaper or visit a music hall. As the cost of railroad travel fell, people could visit family in other towns. Horizons widened and opportunities increased. Industrialization spread around the world today. Often it begins with great suffering, but in the end, however, it produces more material benefits for people. The term laissez-faire refers to the economic policy of letting owners of industry and business set working conditions without interference. This policy favors a free market unregulated by the government. They criticized the idea that nations grew wealthy by placing heavy tariffs on foreign goods. In fact, they argued, government regulations only interfered with the production of wealth. These philosophers believed that if government allowed free trade, the flow of commerce in the world market without government regulation, the economy would prosper. Adam Smith, a professor at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, defended the idea of a free economy or free markets. In his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, According to Smith, economic liberty guaranteed economic progress. As a result, government should not interfere. Smith's arguments rested on what he called the three natural laws of economics: the law of self interest, people work for their own good; the law of competition, competition forces people to make a better product; the law of supply and demand, enough goods would be produced at the lowest possible price to meet demand in a market economy. Adams also stated: 1. Government should not interfere with business. 2. What is good for entrepreneurs is good for everyone. A free market would produce more goods at lower prices, making them affordable by everyone. 3. Free competition gives people the chance to do the job they do the best. 4. Government's only duty is to keep peace and order. By the 1850s, Britain had developed many of the laissez-faire policies. Smith's basic ideas were supported by British economists Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Like Smith, they believed that natural laws governed economic life. Their important ideas were the foundation of laissez-faire capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which the factors of production are privately owned and money is invested in business ventures to make a profit. These ideas also helped bring about the Industrial Revolution. In an essay on principles of population written in 1798, Malthus argued that population tended to increase more rapidly than food supply. Without wars and epidemics to kill off the extra people, most were destined to become poor and miserable. The predictions of Malthus seemed to be coming true in the 1840s. David Ricardo, a wealthy stockbroker, took Malthus's theory one step further in his book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, written in 1817. Like Malthus, Ricardo believed that a permanent underclass would always be poor. In a market system, if there are many workers and abundant resources, then labor and resources are cheap. If there are few workers and scarce resources, then they are expensive. Ricardo believed that wages should be forced down as the population increased. Laissez-faire thinkers like Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo opposed government efforts to help poor workers. They thought that creating minimum wage laws and better working conditions would upset the free market system, lower profits, and undermine the production of wealth in society. Student A is making a chocolate candy bar and selling the candy to people at his school. Student B starts making chocolate candy and selling it. What are things both students are going to do to sell more candy and make more money? They may lower prices, make tastier candy, make a variety of chocolate bars: caramel, nuts, dark chocolate, and milk chocolate. Capitalism relies on competition from companies to help sell us better products at cheaper prices. Student A was making good money selling those candy bars. Do you think he'd have worked harder in adding variety to his candy without Student B's competition? Do you think he would have cut his prices if it weren't for Student B's competition? A high school student can either make money selling pens and paper or candy. Which items would make more money? Candy usually does. Is this a necessary good? Is it productive for students? In a school where learning is supposed to be the primary goal, does this support the goal? If student A was paying people to make his candy, would he want them to make a lot of money so that they can buy the things that he has? During the early 1800s, many people accepted Malthus's bleak view. He was wrong, however. Although the population boom did continue, the food supply grew even faster. As the century progressed, living conditions for the Western world also slowly improved. And then people began having fewer children. By the 1900s, population growth was no longer a problem in the West, but it did continue to affect many nations elsewhere. John Stuart Mill, a philosopher and economist, led the utilitarian movement in the 1800s. Mill questioned unregulated capitalism. Mill wanted the government to step in and improve the hard lives of the working class. He believed in freedom, and he believed that middle class business and factory owners had the freedom to increase their own happiness. But they shouldn't do so in a way to harm others, and government should prevent them from doing so, that is, harming workers. By giving the vote to workers and women, these groups could then use their political power to win reforms. Utilitarians also worked for reforms in many other areas affecting workers, the poor, child labor, and public health. Most middle class people rejected Mill's idea. Only in the later 1800s were his views slowly accepted. Today's democratic governments, including our own, however, have absorbed many ideas from Mill and other utilitarians. English philosopher Jeremy Bentham modified the ideas of Adam Smith. He adapted laissez faire doctrines to justify some government intervention. By the late 1700s, Bentham introduced the philosophy of utilitarianism. To Bentham, all laws or actions should be judged by their usefulness. Did they provide more pleasure or happiness than pain? He strongly supported individual freedoms, which he believed guaranteed happiness. Still, he saw the need for government to become involved under certain circumstances. So he argued that the government should try to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. A government policy was only useful if it promoted this goal. He believed that in general the individual should be free to pursue his or her own advantage without interference from the state. John Stuart Mill, a philosopher and economist, led the utilitarian movement of the 1800s. Mill questioned unregulated capitalism. He wanted the government to step in and improve the hard lives of the working class. Mill believed in freedom, and he believed that middle class business and factory owners had the freedom to increase their own happiness, but they shouldn't do so in a way to harm others, and government should prevent them from doing so, that is, harming workers. By giving the vote to workers and women, these groups could then use their political power to win reforms. Utilitarianism also worked for reforms in many other areas affecting workers, the poor, child labor, and public health. Most middle class people rejected Mill's ideas. Only in the latter 1800s were his views slowly accepted. Today's democratic governments, including our own, have absorbed many of the ideas from Mill and other utilitarians. In industrialized countries in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution opened a wide gap between the rich and poor. Business leaders believed that government should stay out of business and economic affairs. Reformers, however, felt that governments needed to play an active role to improve conditions for the poor. Some reformers believed that capitalism wasn't working. Workers also demanded more rights and protections. They formed labor unions to increase their influence. Do you remember these pictures? Do you think a picture like this is a good argument for capitalism? The same laissez-faire competition theory also shows that if there are people who need work, they will compete with each other to get jobs. This means sacrificing safety, wages, time, and living. Laissez-faire factories make what they want, make how much of what they want, set prices, set wages, and set working conditions. Many political philosophers will begin warning society about the problems of industrialization. While the supporters of laissez-faire economics praised individual rights, other thinkers focused on the good of society in general. They condemned the evils of industrial capitalism, which they believe had created a huge gap between rich and poor. To end poverty and injustice, they offered a radical solution: socialism. Under socialism, society as a whole owns and operates the means of production rather than private individuals. This means of production is the farms, factories, railways, and other large businesses that produce and distribute goods. Socialism grew out of the Enlightenment faith in progress, its belief in the basic goodness of human nature, and its concern for social justice. Capital or investment money, land, raw materials, in this case coal and iron, and factories should be owned and controlled by society, either directly or through government. In this way, wealth could be distributed equally among all citizens. Early socialists tried to build self-sufficient communities in which all of the work was shared and all property was owned in common. When there was no difference between rich and poor, they felt fighting between people would disappear. These early socialists were called utopians, after Thomas More's ideal community. The name implied that they were impractical dreamers. However, one utopian, Robert Owen, did set up a model community to put his ideas into practice. In the 1840s, Karl Marx, a German philosopher, condemned the ideas of utopians as unrealistic idealism. He put forth a new theory, scientific socialism, in which he claimed was based on a scientific study of history. Marx introduced the world to a radical type of socialism called Marxism. Marx and Friedrich Engels, a German whose father owned a textile mill in Manchester, outlined their ideas in a 23-page pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. In their manifesto, Marx and Engels argued that human societies have always divided into warring classes. All history is a struggle between the ruling and working classes, and all societies have been torn by this conflict. The French Revolution was an example of such a conflict. While the wealthy controlled the means of producing goods, the poor performed back-breaking labor under terrible conditions. This situation was an inevitable class struggle or revolution that was going to occur because it was what pushed history forward. Stop this video now and watch the video titled Karl Marx on Schoology. Marx believed that the capitalistic system which produced the Industrial Revolution would eventually destroy itself in the following way. Factories would drive small artisans out of business, leaving a small number of manufacturers to control all the wealth. The large proletariat would revolt, seize the factories and mills from the capitalists, and produce what society needed. Workers sharing in the profits would bring about economic equality for all people. The workers could control the government in a dictatorship of the proletariat. After a period of cooperative living and education, the state or government would wither away as a classless society developed. Marx called this final phase pure communism. Marx described communism as a form of complete socialism in which the means of production, all land, mines, factories, railroads, and businesses would be owned by the people. Private property would, in effect, cease to exist. All goods and services would be shared equally. Published in 1848, the Communist Manifesto produced few short-term results. Though widespread revolts took Europe during 1848 and 1849, Europe's leaders eventually put down the uprisings. Only after the turn of the century did Marxism produce explosive results. In the 1900s, Marxism inspired revolutionaries such as Russia's Lenin, China's Mao Zedong, and Cuba's Fidel Castro. These leaders adapted Marx's beliefs to their own specific situations and needs.